talking to Danny later. In the meantime, we have Anil Dash, whose sole purpose in life is to make my life miserable.
I'm here to talk about his blogging journalism.
He's not!
What I'm here to talk about is how I was right before Danny was right. Facebook is invading our privacy, right? This is our refrain. And the good news is we've solved this problem. I wrote a blog post 2002, 3 of you read it. That was 8 months before Danny's post that he referenced. And it said really easily, set up your own site, control your identity, problem solved. Okay, so we don't ever have to worry about privacy. Let's move on. Because the more important problem is Facebook is invading our publicity. Like a lot of people in the room place right there, we care about our publicity. And there is not the ability to create a public with contemporary tools as there was in the old school blogosphere 10 years ago that many people here participated in. So I'm going to indulge in a little bit of nostalgia. There will be a point later, but mostly just for my own entertainment. So if we go back even further to April 2001, I'm going to show somebody else's blog post. This is a guy named Jason Levine. He was a medical resident at Columbia at the time, and he blogged about uncharacteristically thoughtful thing about the first time he saved a little baby's life. He was a blossoming doctor. It was very moving. A lot of people blogged about it and observed it, and it got shared on Metafilter back when that was a thing. And this guy, Anil, who's a wide pipe blogger. I put this up because I still don't know who the hell this guy is. This is the only avatar I've ever seen for him in the last 10 years. I wouldn't know if I saw him on the street. I mean, just, I know it could be me, but you can bet. That's you being racist. That's not me. And so he found this, and he shared it with somebody else, and then it got caught on from there. And one of the interesting things that happens with that kind of sharing in the old passers-by way, where people who didn't have a like relationship with you and weren't in one of your circles would share things, is you would connect unexpectedly with others. So one of the readers, I think he was in DC then, and one of his readers was somebody else from DC, and that was this woman, Shannon Culberson. That's Jason, who wrote that blog post, who's now a doctor, and that's their little boy who was born 3 weeks ago. So that's 10 years later, they've been married 6 years, that's their second kid. This is what happens when you have that sort of serendipity that happens with unconnected, undefined relationships as are afforded by systems that don't make you explicitly define your relationships. And this is my son expressing his excitement at meeting William. Just wanted a baby picture in there. I hope it's nostalgic. It's really cute, right? Cuter than your son. So besides indulging in nostalgia, there are reasons that we actually are probably a little bit justified in looking back at a golden era of that time, which is we could do things then that we are not able to do now, and we have lost that ability, but it's not that the technology can't support it because we used to have it. We just don't do it as much. And some of this is, you know, the usual complaints about how Twitter sucked all the energy out of our blogs and all those kinds of things, and maybe some of that's true. But one of the biggest things we're missing is that the structured environments for participation don't really afford transgression. And I had a whole diversion here about how I wanted to illustrate this. How many of you remember Mark Pilgrim? Mark Pilgrim, know that name? A bunch of you. It's a technology guy, he's at Google, whatever. And what he did is read the whole thing about the kind of being a militant open source guy, and that's really great. And I was going to show it to you, but he demonstrated transgression in all in form, in purpose, and in connection, because this is what is at the place where that post was that I wanted to show to you. And this is great. He took it down. He took down his entire web presence. Took down all his web presences. But the thing is, like on Facebook, it actually has a like this profile has been deleted page, which is not what he wants. This is, from his standpoint, this is his expression of he's embracing the ephemerality of all things because he's a Buddhist. From my standpoint, he's just like an arrogant monster. But the point is, he has been able to control what is there. And this is the most transgressive thing. This is digital suicide, right? This is a fantastic form of transgression. And he can only do it because this is a space that he controls. I can't control what's left behind of me on most of the public spaces, or what passes for public spaces in the social networks I'm on today. And then I also don't have the same opportunities for intersection that I had when Sunil Doshi, that's his last name. So when Sunil Doshi had passed along that link, I don't have the opportunity for this sort of passersby with whom I have no relationship. We're not, I don't think he's, maybe he follows me on Twitter. But I don't have any relationship with him on any of the explicit declarations, right? The asymmetricality of that is great. But yet, I was still able to send a message, hey, I found this blog post, and 10 years ago you did this thing, and that's how this couple met, and isn't that great? And then that couple introduced me to my wife, and look at all this, you have to babysit all our kids, it's your fault. So the nice thing about this is that unrepresented relationships can yield a lot of benefit. This is not an unfamiliar concept to people, but it's one we've even abdicated the ability to fight for. Like, we don't have a word for these non-friends, unlikers. Like, we don't have a concept for how to represent them in our software. And the other part of this is that that capability of the intersection of unexpected people and our ability to transgress is where you get the great publicity, right? This is what stunts are. You do something mildly transgressive in a way that others who didn't expect to see it can observe. And this is really fun. And the networks that we have right now that we're stuck with suck at it. They're terrible at it. This is all the good stuff and we can't do it. And some of the good forms of this are general assemblies. General assemblies are using the public space. They're using the public space to be slightly transgressive in a way that is still within the structures of what's acceptable in society, but something that was unplanned and unexpected. And we lose a lot because the people who had this ability don't have it anymore. So one of the examples here is what Jason did after this point in his residency is he became a doctor, and what he does for a living is he helps babies with cancer. Right? It's a good job. It's a good job. He does good work. It's a horribly hard job, but he does good work. And he does that at the National Institutes of Health, which is continually facing significant budget cuts. So I spent a couple years thinking, you know what, we're going to tweet at him and that'll fix it. And it doesn't work. And in fact, if NIH is screwed for money and they tweet at us, we can't make visible the fact that we support the work of helping babies with cancer, which is what he does. And commensurately, if we want to say to them, we think you should change to be more efficient so that you don't have to worry as much about budget cuts, they can't listen to us because our general assemblies online are not visible. A stream of replies and tweets is imperfect. As Danny mentioned, you can't even search it. So we don't have a way of showing our force, of demonstrating usefully online. And we don't have any equivalent of the General Assembly because we've completely lost our public spaces to what I call the captive atrium. You go to Midtown and we have all these atriums that are this is public space, is the sign on it. If you have to put the fucking sign on it, it's not public space. Right? This happens all the time. Go look. And there has never been a single Occupy demonstration, even in these big financial companies that have these nominally public space open atria on their ground floors in Midtown. Hasn't happened. Maybe it will. I hope it does. But it doesn't happen. And why? It's because they're captive. They're captive spaces. We know they're business controlled and business owned and owned by the norms and the rights and privileges of that company, even if they have a declaration, explicit declaration of public space signs on it. And they do not afford unexpected behaviors. They don't have any, the only features that we have on the social networks are the ones that the network can anticipate that we wanted. And so they don't have a way of saying, here's how to do something transgressive. By design. It's a problem. It's a problem Dell has to deal with. I'm not blaming them. It's a problem that they don't want, but it's a problem that we should be able to create. And this is specifically about the loss of Danny's public, not Danny's secret. Secret is fine. And secret's actually pretty well handled. Secret's really good if you're not even online. Just keep it offline. But the public space where I can do something like Improv Everywhere does not exist. The angry mob public space does not exist. The eyes on the street public space that I can observe without being a creep in a way that's helpful does not exist. The performance space where I can just get attention by busking does not exist. And we had it. We had it as recently as a decade ago. So that combination of intersection and transgression is what I'm obsessed with, because I don't care about my privacy being compromised. People are working on that. I care about my publicity being compromised, and I don't know how to fix it. So I wanted to ask you guys, all right, what we know is we have a lot of tech for making good networks in these pieces. This is sincerely a question. What are the techniques by which we pry open these systems that we have? They're great networks, we should keep them, to add in public spaces that are uncontrolled, where transgression is possible. It doesn't have to be encouraged, it can be for other things. Some of the pieces that I think are right are, we start with those networks and we add bits that are not controlled by the network providers. I think that requires deliberate breaking of terms of service. Again, sorry, no. I think that we have to have a way to continue to participate in those networks without having to obey their preferences about how to use them. And that is not a technological problem. It's about making a killer app that incidentally breaks the terms of service. What else we got?
Anyone? No, seriously, anyone?
What's so striking about the Facebook thing is you have to log into View, and that single design pattern has eviscerated a lot of the publicness you're talking about. Anything that might violate terms of service would be View. So I'm just going to put up another address that will just spider everything that goes on my Facebook page. It will log in as me and just populate it over to here. This is my public mirror.
Right. So we have tools to do that, and they're explicitly in violation of the terms of service of Facebook. And I'm not troubled by that, but I know they can shut me down, so I have to have a million of those.
Mm-hmm. Well, so one of the things that sort of, Mark Pilgrim was the king of this, something that we had and we kind of lost or didn't sufficiently spread is things like Grease Monkey. Right? Things where people can take what they're looking at, which they own, it's their view of these things, pull it out and transform it and use it in other ways. And that's the violation of the terms of service. That's for all of the sort of exporting of data that Facebook allows, they never let you get the email address. Because the email address is the thing that would enable you to own your own network of, you could get away from Facebook. And the thing that Google Plus doesn't do, which I find kind of interesting, is that its API, and maybe this will change into the future, isn't a thing that lets you build your own Google Plus from that network thing, which you would have thought Google as something that sits to preserve the internet and the searchable internet would have done. Or maybe they're planning.
Well, right now, Google Plus is, they've shifted it now, and basically, open all search now. So the question is, what's the nature of social in terms of being findable in a search engine there? Google's put the stake in the ground saying this is the way it should be. Right now, of course, it's Google Plus, but as we roll down the road, people will say, is this tying this antitrust violation? Inevitably, Google will say to Facebook, okay, let us in, give us our data, which they wants negotiations about, and then Facebook will say no. And, the larger question of how much of this is searchable, what's the nature of how does that change the character, the register of what we're talking about that it's searchable is all over.
Yeah, it's interesting because Danny, you said you'd expect Google to do the thing that would be more open in the favor of the web. And I think that, does everybody still have the assumption? I sure don't anymore. Maybe at some point. The other part I think is very important in its language. From an architectural standpoint, our browsers are our user agents, right? It's the agent of the user. And that is still remarkably sacrosanct. It hasn't been that corrupt. Even the Google provided user agent, I have a lot of control over, an enormous amount of agency over. And very little has been done around using that to privacy and so forth.
I think it's interesting, I'll do my best to project. I think it's interesting to think of it in terms of technical terms, because I think a lot of what is actually shaped is not technology, but how scale combined with technology is complicated matters. And what happened is that a decade ago, yes, things were public, but not that many people were paying attention, which meant that those who wanted to pay attention could get access to it without overwhelming those who were making things public. And then what happens now is the scale of attention has become so great that there's just these massive issues in terms of how you're dealing with different levels and layers of visibility. And I even see this in terms of the ability to do grassroots stuff. A lot of the conversations that we had, for example, in the early blogosphere, could go slowly and they could sort of marinate and they could find their way into a voice that sort of popped. Now, if it doesn't pop in 12 minutes on Twitter, it's dead. Right? And I think that there's something weird to watch. South by is now a dead conference because it's 50,000 people swarming over every little idea. So I think part of where I'm struggling with this is that how do you deal with these different levels of publics when you deal with different levels of scale? And I think that that to me, I totally hear what you're pointing at, but I think it's the scale issue that makes the whole thing messy. Because I think that what you're asking for, in some way, is not a public, but sort of maybe
Yeah.
While we take the last question, can I get Adam up to set up? You can talk extra.
What's interesting is like as they made things more uniform, right? You gain more people. Like they started with your own website, then you go to GeoCities, limited a little more. You get to MySpace, limited a little more. Facebook is just a forum, and then Twitter's 140 characters. But at each jump, you gain a couple orders of magnitude more users, right? But the limitation, that uniformity, was sort of what gave it to you. And I feel like now there are like these services that are just adding these speed bumps. Like Pat says, okay, we can only add like 50 people, or even like that photo DNA thing. Like, all right, well, make it harder to actually share certain types of photos. And that the new services are adding the value out of like creating limitations to what would otherwise sort of be open, right? And so it's almost like nowadays there's a service where it's like I look at it, it doesn't like piss me off in some way where I go like, God, you can totally let me do this, but you're not. It's like I'm almost like not.
Of all the ways to limit my social network, by number would be the last thing I would think of.
Right, but that doesn't, again, that's the.
Right now, hopefully any second.